Imagine once being hailed as the next generation of combat sports royalty, only to see it all collapse in one shocking moment. That is the story of Rampage Jackson, the son of MMA legend Quinton "Rampage" Jackson, whose violent outburst inside a pro wrestling ring turned into one of the darkest scandals in recent fight history. What should have been a stepping stone to building his reputation quickly descended into chaos, outrage, and a storm of controversy that has yet to settle. It is not only Raja's name that now sits under the shadow of scrutiny, but his father's legacy, and even the very sport he once inspired millions within. The incident began like something out of a fever dream, the kind of scene fans might expect in a scripted wrestling show where reality is bent for entertainment. Rampage Jackson stepped into the ring with his opponent, an independent wrestler known as Psycho Stu. The atmosphere was typical of small-scale wrestling circuits: rowdy fans, dramatic entrances, and the expectation of a playful spectacle rather than genuine violence. But what unfolded that night would blur the line between performance and real aggression in ways that left both fans and fighters stunned. As the match progressed, Raja scooped Stu high into the air, mimicking a classic wrestling slam. The crowd initially roared, expecting a move that, while flashy, would remain safe. Instead, Raja drove Stu headfirst into the canvas with a devastating impact that was neither staged nor pulled back. The moment was so violent that the cheers evaporated instantly, replaced by horrified silence. Gasps echoed through the arena as fans realized they were no longer witnessing entertainment, but something far more dangerous. The slam might have been shocking enough on its own, but Raja did not stop there. As Stu lay motionless, his body limp and his eyes vacant, Raja fell to his knees and unleashed a storm of punches. Left hooks, right crosses, and hammer fists rained down in a relentless barrage, with some fans counting over 20 strikes delivered to an opponent who was already unconscious. The referee hesitated, frozen in confusion, perhaps unsure whether this was part of the performance or a real assault. That moment of hesitation was damning. The violence continued unchecked until the damage was irreversible, and the crowd collectively recoiled in horror. What made this moment uniquely disturbing was not only the brutality of the act itself, but also the context in which it happened. Wrestling, even at the independent level, thrives on exaggeration, performance, and the unspoken contract that both participants will protect each other while entertaining the audience. Raja violated that code in the most brazen way possible. Cell phones illuminated the arena as spectators captured the disturbing sequence, and within hours, those clips spread like wildfire across social media platforms. Twitter, TikTok, and YouTube became flooded with replays of the slam and the brutal punches that followed. But unlike most viral wrestling clips that circulate for their comedic value or botched stunts, this one ignited outrage. Fans did not laugh. They did not share memes. Instead, they voiced disgust, horror, and accusations of attempted murder. For people accustomed to seeing violence carefully managed within the rules of combat sports, what Raja did crossed an entirely different line. Commentators quickly chimed in. Many compared the incident not to a wrestling move gone wrong, but to a street mugging caught on camera. One fan wrote bluntly, "That wasn't competition. It was like watching a man get assaulted in front of us." The lack of empathy in Raja's eyes, his wild expression, and the ferocity of the beating seemed less like a mistake and more like a deliberate act of rage. Almost overnight, Rampage Jackson went from a relative unknown to one of the most despised figures in combat sports. His name was trending worldwide, not because of skill or charisma, but because of the sheer shock factor of his outburst. Major outlets like TMZ and ESPN picked up the story, branding the incident with words like brutal, unprovoked, and sickening. Even hardened fight fans, who were no strangers to blood and brutality, struggled to process what they had seen. In less than 24 hours, Raja had ignited a scandal that went beyond his own reputation. His father's legacy, built over decades of iconic fights and unforgettable moments in Pride and the UFC, was suddenly being dragged through the mud. For fans who had idolized Rampage Jackson as one of MMA's wild but respected figures, it was almost unthinkable that his son could commit such an act. One longtime supporter commented, "Rampage was wild, but he was always a professional. This wasn't fighting. This was just thuggery." The backlash was merciless and global. Social media became a courtroom where every second of the footage was scrutinized. Viewers slowed down the video, counting each punch after Stu had clearly gone unconscious. "That's not a fight," one Twitter user wrote. "That's attempted murder." Influencers outside the combat world mocked Raja too, challenging him to step into a real cage fight with trained athletes instead of attacking an unprepared wrestler. As outrage mounted, focus shifted to the referee's inaction. Fans were furious that the official had stood by without intervening, allowing the assault to continue unchecked. "You don't need to be a doctor to know when someone is out cold," one journalist wrote. "That ref froze, and his hesitation could have cost a man his life." Calls for the referee to be banned from future shows poured in. But ultimately, the blame remained squarely on Raja himself. The situation quickly grew more complicated when Rampage Jackson, the former UFC light heavyweight champion and Raja's father, stepped into the controversy. Known for his charisma and larger-than-life personality, Rampage found himself in the impossible position of defending his son against accusations bordering on attempted murder. In a live stream, Rampage acknowledged that Raja's actions looked bad, but insisted there was context fans were missing. The controversy deepened when leaked footage surfaced, showing Raja and Psycho Stu apparently reconciling after the beer can incident. In the clip, Raja shook Stu's hand and muttered, "We're cool. It's all part of the show." Just minutes later, Raja launched his violent assault in the ring. This footage obliterated Rampage's justification, painting a picture of cold-blooded retaliation rather than a heated reaction. For Rampage personally, the humiliation was severe. Memes circulated online comparing his legendary SLAMS to Raja's brutal attack, often accompanied by captions like, "The apple fell far from the tree." For a man whose legacy was cemented in combat sports history, watching his son dismantle that reputation in a single night was devastating. As the week went on, the narrative spun beyond anyone's control. Raja was no longer being framed as a young fighter who lost his temper. He was being depicted as a violent menace who crossed the line between combat and crime. Rampage's desperate attempts to protect him only made matters worse. By then, one truth was painfully clear. Raja Jackson wasn't just destroying his own reputation. He was dragging his father's legacy down with him. And just when it seemed like the scandal couldn't get worse, new evidence emerged that changed the conversation entirely. Hours before the event, Raja had reportedly been live streaming to his small group of followers. In that stream, he ranted about how he had always wanted to mess up a wrestler for real, and bragged that he would prove himself outside of his father's shadow. When challenged, he snapped at viewers, "Watch what I do to him." That revelation shifted the narrative from an uncontrolled outburst to something far darker: premeditation. Suddenly, What had looked like a moment of rage was now being framed as a planned assault, something Raja had hyped up before even stepping into the ring. And with that, the firestorm grew hotter than ever. The leaked livestream was the turning point that turned an already volatile scandal into a full-blown disaster. For those who had been giving Raja the benefit of the doubt, it erased any notion that this was simply a wrestling stunt gone wrong. His own words had revealed intent, and that intent painted everything in a far darker light. The slam, the barrage of punches, and the chilling lack of empathy were no longer seen as an impulsive overreaction. They were interpreted as the execution of a plan that had been brewing for hours. For most observers, this was the smoking gun. One analyst said bluntly, "If you're on video hours earlier saying you're gonna mess someone up for real, and then you do exactly that, it's not a mistake. It's not wrestling. It's assault." Even those who initially tried to defend Raja as a young fighter overwhelmed by emotions fell silent when the live stream evidence surfaced. Suddenly, the narrative wasn't about whether he had crossed a line. It was about how far ahead he had decided to cross it. Meanwhile, the LAPD confirmed that they were reviewing the footage and collecting eyewitness statements. Suddenly, Raja's name wasn't just trending on social media, it was appearing in discussions about criminal charges. The language being used was chilling: aggravated assault, intent to cause grievous bodily harm, and even the possibility of attempted manslaughter. For a young man who had once dreamed of stepping into his father's shoes, the reality was now that he might spend years behind bars instead. As legal discussions grew louder, the MMA community itself erupted with debate. Some fans still clung to the idea that the attack was part of a botched wrestling performance, pointing to moments in the footage where Stu appeared to whisper to the referee before the slam. To them, it looked like a stunt that simply went too far. Wrestling has always blurred the line between performance and reality, and accidents in the ring are not unheard of. But that defense crumbled when contrasted with Raja's own livestream. His words about wanting to make things real, about proving himself outside of his father's shadow, cut through any illusion of an accident. The fallout became increasingly brutal for Raja. Other fighters began to publicly distance themselves from him. Ryan Garcia, the boxing star, called the footage "the worst thing I have watched in a minute" and demanded punishment. UFC veteran Derek Brunson tweeted that Raja didn't belong anywhere near combat sports. Even influencers outside the fight world mocked him, challenging him to step into a real cage if he wanted to prove himself instead of assaulting an unprepared performer. The consensus was clear. Raja wasn't earning respect. He was earning condemnation. The storm reached new intensity when Conor McGregor, one of the sport's most polarizing figures, decided to weigh in. McGregor has never been one to stay silent in controversy, and his statement spread like wildfire. He wrote, "That wasn't fighting. That was rage without discipline. A fighter knows when to stop. Raja doesn't know. He's no fighter. Just a fool dragging his father's name down." The comment hit like a thunderclap. Within minutes, every major fight outlet picked it up. ESPN, MMA Junkie, and others plastered McGregor's words across their feeds. Some praised McGregor for drawing a sharp line between the art of fighting and uncontrolled violence. They argued that his voice carried weight, not just as a UFC legend, but as someone who understood the balance between showmanship and professionalism. But others saw hypocrisy. Fans flooded McGregor's replies with reminders of his own notorious history, throwing a dolly through a UFC bus window in 2018, sucker punching a man in an Irish pub, and numerous arrests and allegations of violent behavior. Conor McGregor, talking about discipline, one critic wrote, is like a wolf lecturing sheep on safety. Memes comparing McGregor's infamous outbursts to Raja's assault circulated almost immediately. But even with the backlash, McGregor had accomplished something. He kept the spotlight firmly on Raja, ensuring the scandal wouldn't die down anytime soon. McGregor's statement also forced other fighters to speak up. Michael Bisping, never one to shy away from voicing his opinion, backed McGregor and said Raja had no business stepping into a combat sports ring again. Daniel Cormier, respected for his balanced takes, called the attack a disgrace to the Jackson name. But it was Nate Diaz, McGregor's longtime rival, who delivered the most shocking statement of all, one that would redefine the conversation and send the controversy spiraling into new, even darker territory. Nate Diaz has always been known for his blunt honesty. Fans admire him not because he's polished or diplomatic, but because he says exactly what's on his mind. Sometimes that honesty comes across as refreshing. Other times, it veers into explosive territory. In this case, it crossed a line so severe that even Diaz's most loyal supporters were stunned. During a live-stream Q&A, Diaz was asked about Raja's actions. His response was chilling. "That kid don't deserve prison. He deserves the death sentence. Straight up. You don't beat an unconscious man like that and walk around free." The words spread like wildfire, instantly overshadowing everything McGregor had said. If McGregor's comments were fiery, Diaz's were nuclear. Fans replayed the clip endlessly. Hashtags like "How Nate Diaz" and "Tarn Death Sentence" trended worldwide, and analysts scrambled to react. To many, it sounded less like commentary and more like a direct call for Raja's life to be ended. For Diaz, the justification was simple. To him, Raja's actions weren't fighting. They were execution. In the world of combat sports, there is an unspoken rule. Protect your opponent when they can no longer protect themselves. Even in the bloodiest brawls inside the octagon, fighters honor that code. They may leave each other bruised, battered, and bloodied. But when the fight is over, respect remains. Raja had shredded that code in front of a live audience. "This ain't fighting," Diaz continued in later comments. "This is murder. Straight up murder. If you do that, you ain't a fighter. You're just a punk hiding behind your dad's name." The words were as raw as they were unforgiving. To a man like Diaz, who built his career on wars inside the cage where respect was everything, Raja's actions were not just unacceptable, they were unforgivable. But the severity of Diaz's words sparked its own scandal. Critics accused him of recklessness, of fueling the cycle of violence by suggesting execution. Even those who agreed Raja deserved punishment balked at the idea of calling for his death. It was one thing to demand jail time. It was another to call for execution in such blunt terms. Yet Diaz's comments had struck a nerve, and whether people agreed or disagreed, they couldn't stop talking about them. With one statement, Nate Diaz had shifted the entire narrative. Raja's violence was still the center of the storm, but now the world was also debating Diaz himself. The focus was no longer just on what Raja had done, but on whether Diaz had gone too far in demanding the ultimate punishment. By the end of the second week, the controversy had grown into something larger than anyone could have anticipated. Rampage Jackson's outburst wasn't just a scandal anymore, it was a defining moment that drew in his father's legacy, the voices of some of the sport's biggest stars, and even a chilling debate over morality, justice, and punishment. The question now wasn't just what Raja had done, but what should happen to him, and whether the fight world itself was prepared to handle the fallout of an act that had shocked it to its very core. The fallout from Nate Diaz's comments lingered like smoke. after a fire. What had started as a scandal centered solely around Raja Jackson's violent outburst now had a new dimension, an ethical debate over whether Diaz himself had gone too far. While some applauded his unfiltered honesty, others condemned him for crossing a moral line that fighters, analysts, and fans should never cross. But if there was one thing clear about the entire saga, it was that the conversation was no longer just about one reckless night in a wrestling ring. It had evolved into a cultural moment, dragging in questions about legacy, morality, the limits of violence, and the responsibilities that come with being in the spotlight. Meanwhile, Raja's situation grew more dire with each passing day. Law enforcement continued to investigate, and sports commissions hinted that lifetime bans could be on the table. Public opinion was stacked firmly against him, and even his father's best efforts to defend him seemed to fall flat. Rampage Jackson, a man known for his charisma and defiance, now appeared cornered, watching helplessly as the Jackson name was dragged deeper and deeper into the mud. It was heartbreaking for many fans who had grown up idolizing Rampage. He was remembered not just for his iconic slams and battles in Pride and the UFC, but also for his personality, a mix of humor, unpredictability, and raw authenticity. To see his son undo that legacy in a matter of minutes was almost unthinkable. Memes comparing the two circulated endlessly. On one side, Rampage lifting opponents in highlight reel fashion. On the other, Raja dropping an unconscious man in a brutal spectacle. The caption, "Like father, like son, not even close." For Rampage, it was the kind of humiliation that no public statement could erase. And yet, he continued trying. In later interviews, Rampage doubled down on the narrative that his son wasn't a bad kid, just emotional and misunderstood. He insisted that Raja had let his temper get the best of him and that the entire incident had spiraled out of control. But those words carried little weight when stacked against the evidence. The footage of the attack, the live stream bragging, and the sheer scale of the backlash. The more Rampage defended his son, the more it seemed like denial rather than clarity. The debate over intent became central to the story. Was this an accident born from the blurred lines of pro wrestling? Or was it something far darker, a premeditated act of violence carried out in front of a live audience? Those who leaned toward the accident theory clung to the idea that wrestling is unpredictable and mistakes happen. But the damning livestream, where Raja openly said he wanted to mess up a wrestler for real, crushed that defense in the eyes of most fans. Legal experts explained that intent would be the difference between charges of assault and something as severe as attempted manslaughter. In that sense, Raja's own words had become his worst enemy. Even as the legal gears turned, the fight world couldn't stop talking. Podcasts, YouTube channels, and fight analysts dissected every angle of the scandal. Some framed it as a cautionary tale about nepotism in combat sports, a young man trying to live up to his father's legacy, but doing so recklessly, without discipline, and without respect for the rules of the sport. Others saw it as evidence of a deeper cultural issue, the glorification of aggression without accountability. Whatever the angle, the conclusion was always the same. Raja Jackson had crossed a line that fighters are never supposed to cross. The harshest critiques came from fighters who had built their reputations on toughness, but also on respect. They reminded fans that combat sports, as brutal as they are, operate within a code. That code is not just about protecting yourself. It's about protecting your opponent when they can no longer defend themselves. For fighters like Nate Diaz, Raja's actions violated that code in the most unforgivable way. And while Diaz's call for a death sentence shocked the world, many fans admitted that at its core, His outrage stemmed from a principle that has always been sacred in fighting: respect for the opponent. But outside of the combat world, mainstream media took a different tone. Major news outlets framed the incident less as a violation of fighting ethics and more as a crime. Words like brutal, unprovoked, and sickening dominated headlines. Pundits who had never followed MMA or pro wrestling suddenly weighed in, treating Raja as little more than a violent criminal. For them, this wasn't about codes of honor or legacies. It was about a man assaulting another man on camera. The storm of outrage spread beyond sports pages and into general culture. Late-night hosts cracked jokes about Rampage's rampaging son. Social commentators drew parallels between Raja's behavior and the dangers of unearned fame, pointing out how children of celebrities often struggle under the weight of their parents' legacy. And in this case, instead of being crushed quietly, Raja had lashed out publicly in the worst possible way. All of this unfolded while Psycho Stu remained largely silent, recovering from his injuries. His absence from the spotlight only added to the tension. Fans speculated endlessly about his condition, with some rumors suggesting permanent damage. Others claimed he was considering legal action of his own, though nothing was confirmed. The silence left room for speculation, and speculation fueled the firestorm even more. Raja himself also went silent. Once brash and outspoken on social media, he disappeared completely after the incident, his accounts either deactivated or abandoned. For some, that silence was an admission of guilt. For others, it was a sign of a young man completely overwhelmed by the storm he had created. In either case, it left the narrative to be controlled entirely by others: his father, his critics, and his accusers. The intensity of the backlash was amplified by the fact that Raja wasn't just anyone. He was Rampage Jackson's son. That detail made the scandal bigger than it might have been otherwise. It tied the incident not just to one reckless fighter, but to a legacy that had been built over decades. Rampage's career had always walked a line between chaos and professionalism, but he had earned respect. Raja, on the other hand, seemed to represent the worst parts of that persona without any of the skill, discipline, or heart that had made his father a legend. As the days turned into weeks, fans began to ask harder questions. Could Raja ever come back from this? Was his name permanently tarnished? And perhaps, most importantly, what did this mean for Rampage himself? Would his legacy now always carry the shadow of his son's scandal? For many, the answer was yes. The apple may have fallen far from the tree, but the damage had rolled downhill, staining everything it touched. The legal process moved slowly, but the court of public opinion had already delivered its verdict. Raja Jackson was guilty in the eyes of fans, fighters, and media alike. What remained uncertain was what kind of punishment the actual justice system would deliver. Would he face fines, suspensions, or something far more severe like prison time? And what role, if any, would his father's influence play in shaping that outcome? Through it all, Nate Diaz's words continued to echo. He don't deserve prison. He deserves the death sentence. For some, those words were hyperbole, Diaz simply venting his disgust in the blunt way he always did. But for others, the phrase stuck because it captured the raw anger many felt watching the video. While most didn't literally believe Raja should face execution, they agreed with the spirit of Diaz's outrage. That this act was so far beyond the boundaries of acceptable behavior that it demanded the harshest possible consequences. And so, the scandal, which had begun with one shocking slam in a wrestling ring, now stood as a defining moment in modern combat sports. It was a cautionary tale about what happens when ego, rage, and legacy collide in the worst possible way. It was a reminder that violence, when stripped of respect and control, ceases to be sport and becomes something darker, something criminal. And it left fans, fighters, and even legends of the game asking themselves an uncomfortable question. If this is what the next generation looks like, what does that mean for the future of combat sports? By the time the scandal entered its third week, the dust still hadn't settled. What many thought would be a viral controversy destined to fade away had instead grown into a saga that defined the conversation across combat sports, wrestling, and mainstream media. Rampage Jackson's violent outburst had transcended the boundaries of the fight world. It had become a story about family, legacy, and the consequences of unchecked rage played out in front of a live audience. The public's fascination with the incident wasn't surprising. It had every element of a modern sports drama: the son of a legend, an outrageous act of violence caught on camera, conflicting narratives of provocation and retaliation, and the voices of some of the sport's most polarizing figures pouring gasoline on the fire. At its core, it was about more than just one fight gone wrong. It was about what happens when ego collides with opportunity, and when discipline gives way to chaos. For Raja himself, silence had become the only option. His disappearance from social media, combined with mounting speculation about his legal situation, painted the picture of a young man overwhelmed by the storm he had created. Gone were the live streams filled with bravado, the boasts about proving himself outside his father's shadow. Now he existed only in clips replayed by fans and pundits, a symbol of what not to do when given a platform. Meanwhile, Psycho Stu's recovery remained shrouded in mystery. Whispers about his condition circulated across forums and social media, with some claiming he was still dealing with serious after-effects of the assault. Others suggested he was weighing his legal options. Whether or not those rumors were true, the silence only added to the weight of the story. Every day that passed without a statement from Stu was another day that the narrative remained frozen in place, dominated by speculation rather than resolution. Rampage Jackson continued to defend his son, though his words now sounded less like arguments and more like desperate pleas. He reminded fans that he too had made mistakes in his youth, that everyone deserves a second chance. But the fight community wasn't buying it. For them, this wasn't about immaturity or mistakes. It was about crossing a line so blatant that forgiveness seemed impossible. The comparison to Rampage's own antics became unavoidable. He had been wild, unpredictable, and often controversial, but he had never crossed into something that looked this much like a crime. To many, Raja wasn't carrying his father's torch. He was extinguishing it. And then there was the ever-lingering shadow of Nate Diaz's words. He don't deserve prison. He deserves the death sentence. The remark had shocked the world, but it refused to fade. Fans debated endlessly whether Diaz had gone too far or whether he had simply voiced a brutal truth. Analysts dissected the meaning behind it. Was Diaz literally advocating for execution? Or was he using hyperbole to emphasize the severity of Raja's betrayal of combat's unspoken code? Either way, the phrase had embedded itself in the scandal, ensuring that every conversation about Raja included not only his violence, but also Diaz's chilling judgment. This wasn't the first time Nate Diaz had made headlines for blunt remarks, but it may have been the most impactful. His reputation as someone who says what others won't gave weight to the statement, even as critics called it reckless. And for Raja, it was the ultimate humiliation. Not only condemned by fans and fighters alike, but declared unworthy of life itself by one of the sport's most respected veterans. Whether or not Diaz meant it literally, the damage was done. The words had become part of the scandal's DNA. As the weeks turned into months, the story evolved into something bigger than any single fight or fighter. Podcasts revisited it as a case study in sports culture. YouTube documentaries dissected every frame of the footage, from the slam to the final punch. Forums debated endlessly about whether Raja should face prison, a lifetime ban, or simply fade into obscurity. Some even speculated that he might attempt a redemption arc years down the line, though most agreed that his name would never fully recover. The scandal also forced uncomfortable conversations about the role of legacy in combat sports. Children of legends often face immense pressure, and some rise to the challenge with discipline and respect. Others, like Raja, crumble under the weight of expectation, lashing out in destructive ways. Was Raja's downfall inevitable, given the shadow cast by his father's larger-than-life persona? Or was it simply the result of personal flaws, ego, immaturity, and a dangerous lack of control? There were no easy answers, but the questions lingered, echoing across fight culture. In the end, the saga of Raja Jackson became less about him as an individual and more about what he represented. To some, he was a cautionary tale about the dangers of chasing fame without discipline. To others, he was proof that combat sports needed stricter safeguards, clearer boundaries, and harsher consequences for those who crossed them. And, to his father's fans, he was a reminder that legacy is fragile, that decades of respect can be jeopardized by a single reckless act from the next generation. What remained certain was that Raja Jackson's name would forever be tied to this scandal. No matter what he did in the future, whether he attempted a comeback, disappeared from the spotlight, or tried to rebuild his life outside of sports, the footage would follow him. The slam, the punches, the outrage, and Nate Diaz's unforgettable words would remain part of his story forever. And so, the final chapter of this saga is still unwritten. Will Raja face prison time? Will he attempt to rebuild his reputation? Or will he simply fade into obscurity, remembered only as the son of a legend who squandered his chance with one night of uncontrollable violence? The answers remain uncertain. What is certain is that the combat sports world will never forget what happened that night in the wrestling ring, and the debates it sparked will echo for years to come. For fans, fighters, and analysts alike, the lesson is clear. Violence without respect is not sport. It is chaos. Discipline is what separates a fighter from a criminal, a warrior from a thug. Raja Jackson failed to understand that, and in doing so, he paid a price that may follow him for the rest of his life. And as for Nate Diaz, his words remain etched into the scandal like a scar. Whether you agree with him or not, there's no denying that his blunt honesty captured the raw emotion of the moment in a way no one else could. He forced the world to confront a question they might not have wanted to ask. What punishment truly fits an act that looks more like execution than competition? So, what do you think? Was Raja Jackson's outburst the result of immaturity, a misunderstanding, or something far darker? Did Nate Diaz go too far in calling for the ultimate punishment? Or was he simply saying what many fans were already thinking? The conversation is far from over, and your voice matters in how this story is remembered. If you've made it this far, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and tell us whether you think Raja deserves a second chance, or if his career should be finished for good. Don't forget to like this video if you found the story compelling, and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the most shocking scandals, unforgettable moments, and untold stories from the world of combat sports. This was the story of Raja Jackson, the son of a legend, whose one night of uncontrollable rage may have destroyed not only his future, but also stained the legacy of his father. And in the words of Nate Diaz, it raised a chilling question. Was this just a crime? Or was it something worthy of the harshest judgment imaginable? Only time and history will decide.